Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this conversation. I'm going to hand over to Barry.
Hello, everyone. I'm Barry Knight, and I'm going to be facilitating this conversation. And we're going to be having a participative session. We're going to be stimulated by 3 people, but then we're going to turn over to you, and you will have a chance to ask questions, to make comments. If you like, as the session goes on, to put stuff in the chat, we'll try and take a note of that. This is a safe space. We want to, encourage conversations, listen deeply to one another, and contribute constructive thoughts. It's a follow-up to one we had, I think, last month around planetary strikes for peace. And the main theme of that was Indy Johar's idea that really peace, developing peace, should be an active process rather than a reactive one. And that all told, we're rather too passive about that. And this is a really fascinating kind of sequel to that, although it's got the content, as you'll see when I introduce Andrew Kelly in a moment, is really vivid in its own light. And we had a sort of planning session around a week ago. And I mean, to be quite honest with you, Antarctica's a place that I hadn't given much thought to, and I realise as a result of that conversation that it's somewhere that we really need to get to grips with, because there are some emerging issues there that where planetary strikes for peace could be very relevant, because it could become a conflict zone, and that's the kind of situation we're in. Andrew's going to speak first. Then Indy, who was the leader in the session last time, is going to respond to that and see how that actually fits with his notion of planetary peace strikes. And then we're going to hear from Apolline Roger, who will from Client Earth, who will give her perspective on the discussion. And then we will turn over to a participative session, and we're going to relax into this. Just get yourself seated and enjoy the ride. Andrew, would you like to tell us who you are and where you are, and just a couple of paragraphs about yourself?
Thanks, Barry. I'm joining you from Sydney, Australia. It's just gone 12:35 in the morning. But it's great to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. A little bit about me. I grew up here in Sydney, Australia. I trained as an economist. As a young man, after leaving school, I spent 10 years in banking. So as an economist, I often say that I'm well qualified and highly qualified to tell you exactly how the world does not work. And that has led me through a career of banking, and the last 25 years in philanthropy, raising money for refugees, kids at risk, homelessness, education, medical research, and now most recently 4 years as the former CEO of the Antarctic Science Foundation based in Hobart here in Australia. Yeah, thank you.
Well, why are you letting me stand? Sorry, carry on. Andrew freeze?
No, thanks, Barry.
You okay?
Oh, he was handing back to you.
Sorry?
He was handing the mic back to you.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Andrew. I was listening. I was thinking you were carrying on a bit longer. I'm obviously half asleep here. So tell us tell us about a bit about Antarctica and what are the issues there.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. So let's go back a little bit. This is the proceedings of a conference that was held in Princeton in 1955 entitled man's role in the changing face of the Earth. Over 7 days in June 1955, the notable scientists of the time came together to talk about man's impact on the Earth. In the proceedings, which run to 1,200 pages, Antarctica is mentioned only once, in a discussion entitled The Changes in Physical Phenomena, where questions were raised as to what maximum sea levels might have been in the past and the chances that Antarctica may melt. Now, if you go forward to March of last year, The Economist newspaper ran with a leader on Antarctica for the first time that I can remember, entitled Earth's Largest Refrigerator is Defrosting. And it concluded with the quote, "For too long, too few have worried about Earth's most remote continent and its largest refrigerator, while attention focused on the fires that burned literally and figuratively on more populated shores. Antarctica was variously portrayed as an explorer's playground, a utopian land of scientific cooperation, or a poster child for environmental protectionism. The exceptionalism here is misguided." And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit tonight about why Antarctica is important, how it is governed, and the pressures that we're seeing down there, both from a physical, biological, and political standpoints. So, for starters, Antarctica is twice the size of Australia, or the same landmass as China and India combined. It doubles in size in winter when the sea freezes around the continent and becomes a large reflector of heat and light back into space. Now, this expansion and contraction of sea ice around the Antarctic continent is the largest natural process that occurs on Earth on an annual basis. The circumpolar current around the continent represents the heartbeat of our Earth and drives our climate and global ocean systems. That reflector that is Antarctica pushes all manner of heat and light back into space and has done so over millennia, over millions and millions of years. Antarctica contains 75% of the world's total freshwater reserves, which, if they were to all melt, would equate to over 50 metres of sea level rise around the Earth. The Southern Ocean that surrounds Antarctica is a global nursery for fish underwritten by Antarctic krill, the keystone species of the whole ecosystem. Whales, seals, penguins, and fish all eat Antarctic krill. Krill is also important because it absorbs carbon from the atmosphere through phytoplankton, through its food. They eat phytoplankton and then excrete the waste to the sea floor, and so they perform an important role in getting carbon out of the atmosphere through the water column and back to the sea floor where we want it. Now, the Southern Ocean absorbs around 12% of all human CO2 emissions, and all oceans globally absorb around about 30%. Forests absorb about 26%, and the remaining 44% is the shortfall that we have a problem with and that we're trying to curtail through our own activities. Now, the Antarctic is governed in a very unique way. From Article 1 of the Antarctic Treaty signed in 1959, the important quote is, "In the interest of peace for all mankind, Antarctica shall not become the scene of international discord." And so, after World War II and on the eve of the Cold War, this treaty froze all territorial claims on the icy continent. There were 12 original signatories to the treaty, 7 claimant states. So Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the United Kingdom were joined by Belgium, Japan, South Africa, the United States, and the USSR. This document is very simple, but it is one of the great achievements of humanity. It sets Antarctica aside for peace, science, and cooperation. It was essentially an arms control treaty to demilitarize Antarctica in the 50s. And the template was the Svalbard Treaty of 1920, which protected the archipelago and gave sovereignty to Norway and removed the threat of conflict in that region. Now, the strength of the treaty is that is its unanimity. It can only be changed by unanimous vote, and its weakness is unanimity. It can only you can have detractors and free riders or defectors that won't play ball. Ever since the treaty was signed, the currency of Antarctica has been science, and cooperation and consensus has created a peace in that continent. It is the only continent that has never had an armed conflict. Further, the Madrid Protocol of 1991 banned mining in Antarctica and came into force in 1998. And importantly, the treaty governs all that occurs on the continent, but the seas around Antarctica are governed by CAMLR, which is the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And this is a separate convention. The Secretariat is based in Hobart in Australia, and they meet, as does the Antarctic Treaty parties, once a year to discuss matters relating to the seas around Antarctica. So the next annual meeting of the Antarctic Treaty parties will occur in Milan next month, 23rd of June through to the 3rd of July. This is set down each year for signatories and interested parties to Antarctica to discuss results from the previous year, plans for the upcoming year, and to wrestle through issues of protection, governance issues, all manner of pressures that I'll go through further down the line. The treaty is due for review in 2048, but this is not a renegotiation as is often touted. Again, this review would require a unanimous motions and changes by all parties. So what's happening in Antarctica? Antarctica is informative as a canary in the coal mine, as it were, of climate disruption. In the last couple of years, Antarctica has sent humanity some very straightforward messages. Firstly, Antarctic sea ice, which I mentioned, expands and contracts around the continent across the year. We've kept records of those extents daily from satellites since the mid-60s. A couple of years ago, we reached the lowest extent both in summer and in winter that we've ever experienced. And this is due to changes in our atmosphere and changes in the sea as both the atmosphere and the water column warm up. The sea is not freezing the way it used to, and that's actually reducing that parasol effect of reflecting heat and light back into space. So that's quite a clear and present danger for humanity. That leads to warming oceans. A couple of seasons ago, we lost 4 emperor penguin colonies. Each suffered catastrophic breeding failures when thousands of chicks and eggs perished when that sea ice in their traditional breeding grounds gave way. So emperor penguins go back to the same breeding grounds every year, and that sea ice could not support those colonies. And so we lost a total generation across 5 colonies, somewhere in the order of 20,000 chicks and eggs, as well as some adults. So that was a clear message that things are changing in Antarctica. We've not seen that before. And then also we've seen the meltwater from ice in Antarctica is causing a rapid slowdown in the overturning circulation of the Southern Ocean. So the Southern Ocean is like a pull pump for Earth. It keeps all of our oceans fresh. It throws its current up into every ocean in the world. If you're a droplet of water and you started your journey today around Antarctica, you would be thrown up into each of the oceans and return to Antarctica, and it would take you 1,000 years to return back to the Southern Ocean overturning circulation. we've found that circulation has slowed by about 30% over the last 30 years, and it's looking to continue to slow up to 2050. This is not good news. This will have knock-on effects for populations of fish, and it will disrupt, we expect, the breeding of krill, and it'll also have a deleterious effect on the Southern Ocean as a carbon sink, a very valuable carbon sink. We have warming seas. We know this around the globe. In particular, at the equator, fish are moving away from the equatorial waters at 1 kilometre per year, either north or south. That's encroaching on fish who would normally otherwise have bounteous breeding and feeding grounds. They're now being encroached upon by other species as fish move away from the warm middle. This is also destabilizing in Antarctica the glaciers that jut out from the continent, and that warm water is getting up underneath the glaciers and into the grounding line, which is making them lose stability. You may have heard of the Doomsday Glacier. The Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica is held in by a plug of ice, and we're very concerned about the possibility of this warm water getting up underneath the grounding line and releasing that glacier into the ocean via fracture. So what we're seeing just in the last few years is being underlined by researchers. In that Economist article, Martin Seegert from the Grantham Institute said, when I first started working in Antarctic glaciology 30 years ago, Antarctica was all about adventure and discovery. He says it's still about those things, but now it's got really serious really quickly. And so this notion of romance and age of exploration and the majesty of Antarctica is fantastic. It's an amazing place to be a researcher. But things are starting to quicken up in terms of what we're seeing. So what does this mean economically, both to us around the world, but also in Antarctica? Antarctica's really important in terms of krill. Krill is the keystone species of Antarctica and arguably underwrites the global marine life as a nursery. We are now seeing fishing of krill in the Southern Ocean to turn into krill oil products and also into livestock feed. This seems ridiculous, to be frank, to be taking the keystone species that everything else relies upon and turning it into a product of its own. Tourism in Antarctica is skyrocketing. So the last couple of years, tourism has exceeded over 100,000 people accessing Antarctica, primarily through cruises. Antarctica is usually a bucket list trip to tick off as the last or most inaccessible continent. These trips are really expensive for tourists and financially lucrative for operators. And in my time, I've seen little or no evidence that the experience actually produces a sustained will or collective impetus to change the hearts, minds, and narratives or economics of those returning back home. That just doesn't seem to happen. So it's great to go and see it, but Antarctica could probably do without you. In terms of resources, Antarctica previously was part of Gondwanaland, so 450 million years ago, it actually sat at the equator before it broke up into the major continents and then moved to its polar position now. And so as such, it was a lush tropical forested land, but it's no surprise that it is full of resources: coal, oil, gold, possibly rare earths, gemstones, and gas. Now, Russia has just completed a prospecting trawl over the last season in the British Antarctic Survey in West Antarctica, and they have found significant deposits of oil and gas. And I have to agree with Dr. Alan Cummings of the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, who says there is no good time in human history to start extracting hydrocarbons from Antarctica. But these are the pressures, the economic pressures at play in a very populated world needing resources. Now, in terms of politics, Australia has the largest stewardship of Antarctica at 42% of East Antarctica. It's funny to call Antarctica, which is south, east and west, but basically east is underneath Australia and west is underneath Africa, South Africa. China is not a signatory to the treaty, but it does now have 5 bases, one in West Antarctica and the other 4 on or near the Australian stewardship. Russia has 10 research bases. 5 of these are year-round. And some of the dynamics that we're seeing in Antarctica, firstly, there's distrust. All of a sudden, there is distrust. That bases could act as platforms for powerful satellite surveillance and radar systems. There's suspicions that the Chinese People's Liberation Army personnel have participated in Chinese affairs on the continent, which is a breach of the Antarctic Treaty, if true. There's suspicion that dual-use technology that could be argued to be either research or military is being deployed in Antarctica. And these suspicions are not just aimed at Russia and China. They are also aimed at other nations, including the US. Since Trump's second election as president, trust in the US has plummeted. He has put a line through $60 million worth of funding through the National Science Foundation, which supports 3 all-year stations for the US in Antarctica. The only station at the South Pole is run by the United States. And so this contraction by the US, as well as a significant expansion of presence by Russia and China, is creating tension at the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings. So watch that space in June, but also the Kamilar meetings, which are held later in the year, usually around September, October. These actors are now seeking to redraw the norms, rules and values of the Antarctic Treaty System, and mainly for resource and geopolitical gain. The MPAs, the marine protected areas that are governed by Kamilar in the oceans around Antarctica, there's been very little movement on conservation efforts over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Each time these come up for a vote, China, with forecasting a very hungry population for the future, is not prepared to take resources off the table, and Russia is very happy to run interference on these meetings. The current downside is that the current status quo could be at risk, allowing other players to feel more free in pursuing their individual interests rather than the collective interests of science primarily, but also, the world at large. And if we do get to 2048 and we decide that the Antarctic Treaty is no longer fit for purpose, then we're probably in a world that has got much bigger problems than simply what's going down on in Antarctica. But the increasingly fractious nature of 3 great superpowers, Russia, China and the United States, deciding to carve up Antarctica into 3 segments between now and 2048 or beyond, whilst unlikely, should remain top of mind, because if we go right back to the very beginning, Antarctica is our global household's refrigerator. It regulates our climate, our oceans. It puts food on the table, certainly in terms of marine resources for a great portion of the global population. I'd just like to close with 2 points. Firstly, as CEO over the last 4 years, I've been charged with raising money to do transformational Antarctic research beyond that which is funded by the Australian Antarctic Program. When I started this role, I thought like 30% of people would be interested in Antarctica, and I was completely wrong. Everybody's interested in Antarctica and fascinated by it, but the fascination is, as I say, a mile wide, but the actual technical understanding and know-how of its importance is just barely an inch deep. And secondly, while we did attract a group of extraordinarily interested and committed supporters, the common reply from philanthropy amounted to, isn't this a job for government? And isn't it something that my taxes should pay for? And so these are some of the dynamics and pressures that we're seeing around why Antarctica is important, how it's governed, what it represents, why we need it in as close to pristine condition as possible, and some of the pressures that are mounting on Antarctica over the next few years. Thanks a lot, Barry.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. That's really clear and very troubling. I mean, troubling from two main angles. One, the environmental crisis that seems to signify, but secondly, the prospect for dividing up and conflict between the major powers. And Tamsin's put a very apt comment, I think, in the chat, that's, I think, addressed to Indy. Sounds like a perfect site for a preemptive planetary peace strike. And just Indy, perhaps you could just tell us what a preemptive planetary peace strike would be, before we get into how you think about how this might actually relate to what's happening in Antarctica. Over to you, Indy.
Thank you, and thank you, Andrew, for such a complete and precise description. So, I mean, just going straight into the kind of question, Barry. So planetary peace strikes sort of came from the recognition that we're now there are locations and geographies in the world, and you could look at the Himalayas and other places, key hydrological sites, which are systemically in a period of accelerated degeneration. Even boring places like the Alps are not likely to have their glaciers by 2070. Without the glaciers, you lose predictable water systems and farming systems and other critical environments. And those sites are also have a propensity to trigger, certainly like the Himalayas, a vulnerability between 3.5 billion people, and also a propensity of conflict, as you're starting to see already between India and Pakistan and the use of the water system, a vulnerability for 3 nuclear powers to go into a runaway cascade. And in those environments, in those contexts, given the scale, once you tip those environments into cascading landscapes of war, it feels very unlikely that we will be able to pause that conflict. And because of the scale of the cascades that we are in the middle of. And we also have to recognize that our means of violence, when you include not just tactical nukes and other things, but also biowarfare and CRISPR-engineered environments, means that once you see that landscape of war and the democratization of weapons of mass destruction that we're seeing, they open up us to a future which is not rooted in micro-violences, but runaway violences. And I think one of the presumptions that we are often making in environments is that these violences, and certainly I've been in rooms where people of significant wealth have said, well, Indy, we can afford 1 billion people on the planet, and we're going to get down to 1 billion people. And the passive assumption is that somehow when these violences are let loose, that there will be space and availability for 1 billion people to be left. Whereas I would argue that the cascading violences that we're unleashing, and it's worth recognizing the war machine is not part of our carbon budget. It isn't part of our carbon budget. It's superfluous on top of it. And if you look at the value or the market price of our war infrastructure around the world and look at what's going on, you are seeing the market signaling value capital is allocating to the war machine right now. And all of capital, significant amounts of capital is allocated to the war machine. So in that context, and if you start to understand that this is a runaway scenario, like a mutually assured destruction model, then preemptive peace becomes a necessary intervention. Not a nice intervention, but a necessary intervention to be able to construct, in the recognition of mutually assured destruction, a new landscape of peace, and being able to recognize that as a necessity, not we cannot afford to go through World War II to get to a peace beyond World War III. Well, now we're going to have to recognize the runaway violences and react prior to them, because I'm not sure there is another pathway through the violence to a new peace because of those risks. So this all sits also with the recognition of rooting things on the landscape of security, and security in dimensions not of boundary of India and China, but also entanglements of issues and mutually assured security frameworks that start to recognize a different landscape to how we operate, and requires, I think, a different type of diplomacy, where you have to be able to construct a diplomacy between a lens of security and stabilization, but also a civic comprehension of some of these risks to be able to build these mutually assured pathways. And that, I think, is a different model. It also requires us to understand different world logics. I think we are not all playing from the same logic. So you could argue much of, say, an American worldview is around we the people and our assets, i.e. the presentism of value right now and the discounting of future value. I think other civilization logics have different logics, i.e. the continuity of civilization versus the presentism of value. So they discount the present relative to the desire for continuity. That creates fundamentally different negotiation positions for the construction of peace, which requires us to be able to operationalize in different ways. So, and I think, Andrew, what you said there on the Antarctic is so vital. And what I would say is that, unfortunately, we may be in a route where we are no longer able to conserve the Antarctic, but we'd have to regenerate it and to stabilize it more than just conserve it. And that is because if you look at the level of gases that are already committed, you look at the trajectory we're on, we're now in a different cycle. And it's critical pathway in terms of both nutrition, but also refrigeration, in terms of actually the narrow self-interest of civilizations to exploit us, creating a vicious framework of sort of a degenerative spiral that I think will be systemically destructive. So the question then becomes is, if the Antarctic treaties were post-war World War II diplomacy, and they were functions of the stability of a post-World War II power and peace construction of power in a particular way, what does it look like as that hegemony of power and influence is breaking, and we started to operate in a new planetary, multipolar, multi-logic worldview? How do we construct the Antarctic and create the landscape for regenerative pathways for the Antarctic, recognizing it as a pathway that is essential for mutually assured, to avoid mutually assured destruction? Because, yeah, I mean, I think the current, if we just lose one of the major ice shelves, I think, Andrew, the numbers are 65 centimeters by the end of the century, and that's without any feedback loops being cycled in. But Andrew, you'll know better on these things than I will. But 65 centimeters basically is then just global average temperature, sea level rise. If you include the impacts of tides, any form of violent events, you start to have massive impact on large inhabitable zones around the planet and the systemic destabilization that will cause as a runaway mutually assured crisis environment. And that's just literally, I think, not losing the whole of the Antarctic, but just losing one of the significant ice shelves, I think. And Andrew, you'll be able to correct me on these figures just to make sure we're correct as well. So I think why I'm really pleased that I'm here, and Barry and Tamsin for convening this, I think this requires a different way of looking at the problem, and it requires us to stabilize and position a new type of diplomacy rooted in a different form of enlightened self-interest. And I also think that this diplomacy might be a function of the middle powers. So this is my little intervention, that in a sense, this is a diplomacy of increasingly we have a rise of middle powers, which is often ignored. And those middle powers have significant influence. So a collaboration not just between the interests of Russia, China, and the US, but a rise of a collaboration of the middle powers and their ability to actually drive integrity into the system may be quite significant here. And actually that third optics of diplomacy might be one of the greatest significant moves. And how do we get the middle powers to align around not just self-interest, but also enlightened self-interest and build the alliance of power to hold the three powers in check and to invite them to be their better selves may be a very powerful conversation. And just to bridge into perhaps some of the brilliant work that Client Earth and Apollina does is how do we bridge, what's our first step into that reality? How can we use our current frameworks to start to create a new civic political force to be able to recognize these futures and create the litigation forces for holding certain powers in check, holding certain treaties into place, creating accountability in different ways, or whether it's krill farming and other things that are going on, how do we create the preservation cycles and be able to hold that, I think is a really first dimensional, first horizon force as we move through this enlightened diplomacy framework that I think will be really critical. So maybe, Barry, if that's enough as a sort of frame
Great.
opening some up.
Yes, thank you, Indy. I mean, I think we'll be referring back to you, both back to you and to Andrew later on. But for now, that's a great start. And for Apolline, a difficult question, given that the peace industrial complex is geared to actually the end of World War II, which and the Bretton Woods arrangements with all that United Nations are really so outdated. We need to find different kinds of, institutional pathways if we're going to have any chance to actually address this issue. But let's hear from you, Apolline. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Happy to. So hi, very happy to be with you all. So I'm Apolline Roger. I work for Planet Earth. I'm the head of innovation in Planet Earth. For those who don't know us, we are an environmental charity which uses the law to protect people and planets, and we work in many different places in the world. So we have many offices in the EU, but we also have a presence in China, in the US, in Tokyo, and we have work in other continents. That's for the very short one. Of course, I'm happy to say more if there are any questions on specific things. Of course, I will touch upon your question, Barry, but I was thinking that it could be useful if I almost play back what I heard, but from my lens, which is in a way an answer to your question. And, if you think about institutions, how they are created, how they were created, how the new ones will be created, it always starts with a myth or a theory or a perception of what is right. And here I was fascinating to hear both, both intervenants in the sense that we have almost a polarity here. On one side, some foundational myths, which are around Antarctica with, the fascination that is still there. I think, Andrew, you mentioned it. And of course, we have also the core purpose of the treaty, which is humanity, the common goods and peace, which are those very, high level core needs of humanity. We also have the fact that there is no human inhabitants, which is also part of that foundational myth and the perception of the Antarctica. So we have all that, which is very, I think, fertile ground to go in the direction that Indy indicated. And on the other hand, we have all the pressures which are developing against that foundational myth. And if you look even at past example of what was considered as a planetary good, look at OpenAI and, their foundational myth of being good for humanity and how it was turned completely upside down with financial pressure. Look at the deep seabed, which was also considered as a planetary good, which is now completely turned upside down with the first license being authorized. Think about space as well, which was also considered a planetary good and which is more and more privatized. So we have that foundational myth, which is still available, I think, and which matters, which is still alive, and we have all those pressures against it. And so I think that's where the theory, the approach, the perception that Indy described, I think is so interesting because it helps us to ground ourselves into the foundational myth, which is still present, but propose an alternative to the pressures that we are seeing and which are destroying our planetary goods at the moment. Then I also find it interesting to distinguish between the different type of pressure that you talked about, Andrew, when it comes to Antarctica. So I think we have the direct pressures, so they might be mining in the future, there might be militarization in the future. Krill fishing might get even more intense. And all those absolutely require some type of governance or counter pressure. And so that's where what Indy was talking about, what type of mitigation can help to counter that pressure, that's hyper relevant and that can be done with the current systems that we have. Then you have the indirect pressure. So the fact that the way Antarctica is suffering, it comes from activities which are not in Antarctica. And all the governance system which governs Antarctica is limited to Antarctica. So it looks at there only. And here, of course, you have a mismatch which creates a lot of problems. So here for me, the question is, how do you create a presence of Antarctica into whatever forum, discussion, legislation, governance, which is considering the other pressure, the pressure which are relevant for Antarctica. And that's where I think the spreading of the awareness of Antarctica as the ultimate tipping point really matters. And also, again, reviving the foundational myth as the beauty, the isolation, the connection, the entanglement with humanity is crucial. And then you have the pressure that Indy just mentioned. Like, we know that it's not about protecting anymore. That's also about regenerating. And so what does it look like in terms of a governance system? Like, how do you put in place the system which would allow shared interest, shared purpose, vast investments potentially, which will be channeled to Antarctica? And that's another question. And for all that, I wanted to bring a work that is not developed by Planet Earth, but that I found absolutely fascinating, which has been led by Cormac Cullinan and Roberta Bosu and many others, which is called the Antarctica Rights Coalition. You can Google it and you will discover great work there, where basically their idea is to give personhood to Antarctica. The personhood which is very close to state personhood, because one of the ideas with that is to allow a presence of Antarctica into those international forums which are handling other topics than Antarctica. So, of course, for example, the COP, the climate COP and others. And so that's definitely an interesting approach, I think, which has a lot of value, and that you can also, develop for the other type of pressure that we're talking about. So for the direct pressure, what would it look like? Litigation done by Antarctica against some of the major direct pressure. For regeneration as well, what would it look like? How would it help to have a governance system which is built on that premise? How is it different from what we have done in the past? It's definitely not the one way forward, but I think that's a very interesting idea to consider, especially with the ultimate specificity of Antarctica, which is that you don't have indigenous population, which makes it very different from the usual discussion on rights of nature, which generally is always hand in hand with indigenous rights. Yeah, and maybe likewise, I don't want to keep the floor for too long, but those are the ideas I wanted to throw into the mix.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Apolline. That was very, very helpful. It seems to me that we have had three really very stimulating presentations. I'd like now to turn it over to you to ask questions or to make comments. And what would be great is if we could, towards the end of this discussion, maybe find some pathways forward, because this is such a knotty, difficult problem that many people are not aware of. Peter, you've got your hand up. Can I come to you?
Yeah, thanks, Barry. And just a shout out to my fellow Sydney-sider, Andrew. This is a question, I guess, for him, but I'm also happy if some of the other panelists take it up. I just wanted to sort of briefly discuss or just sort of bring up the topic of whether it's possible, you think, within the current confines of the Antarctic Treaty System to try and change the behaviour of some of the recalcitrant states. So you said before, I think you mentioned by name China and Russia, particularly in the context of the marine protected areas. And I'm just wondering, you might have some insight from being part of those conversations, whether there's any activity going behind the scenes to try and change their behaviour. I think it's a really good example. You spoke a little bit about the krill issue, and China's efforts to fish as much krill out of the Southern Ocean is in fact an effort to try and solve a different problem for them. And so it's interesting that in trying to solve one problem, particularly around fish stocks in other parts of the world, they're generating fish farms, I think, in mostly the Yellow Sea. And so it's sort of, I think the phrase that's being popularized these days is iatrogenic, which means it's a medical term. It means that the cure is worse than the disease, or that it's a disease caused by an effort to try and cure something else. And so I wonder whether there's also the possibility of trying to bring conversations around Antarctica into wider conversations around global efforts to conserve marine environment. And I point to the recent High Seas Treaty is a good example. So opening that up for the panelists if they've got any answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Peter.
Peter.
Andrew, did you want to comment on that?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So to Indy's point about middle powers, I think this is a really important area to tackle. So the trivia quiz question, which is who is the most recent addition to the Antarctic Treaty System? The meat tray winner is for the answer of Saudi Arabia. Okay, so Saudi Arabia is now involved in the ATS, which is perverse, but it's also really important for all the points that Indy made and the question you're asking, Peter, because when you have a economic and regional power like Saudi Arabia at the table, you can then start to move other geopolitical tiles. Now, the other element is that we are now more connected and have more information about what goes on in the world and specifically in Antarctica and the politics, which didn't happen even 10 years ago. So there's a significant pressure on the consultative meetings to open up. They are not transparent. They do not permit journalists. They issue a communique 6 months after the meeting, which is 6 months before the next meeting. And so nothing really is exposed from those meetings. But what we do know is that at recent meetings when Russia got up to speak at the Berlin meeting in 2022, all of the power went out. When Ukraine got up, all of the communications equipment broke down. And so there's these games that are played at these meetings. And by bringing those middle powers into play, you can start to make some of these larger powers play by the rules, if you like. And increasing transparency is very important to that as well. Against that backdrop, without transparency and without communications and fair play, we've seen almost no movement over 15 years on marine protected areas. And just a point, China is gearing up their fishing fleet for krill, but the biggest krill fisheries or fishing industry is out of Norway and the Northern Circle.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Peter. In the meantime, while you fix it, Linda, let's turn to Lucy. You put a tantalizing comment in the chat about a book that had some interesting stuff in. Would you like to, Robert Macfarlane, the nature writer, would you like to take?
Sure. I mean, this is probably a naive comment given the expertise on this call, but the rights of nature movement is new to me. And Macfarlane is a well-known, brilliant English language writer whose newest book is called Is a River Alive? And it's basically asking this question of how do you treat rivers, riverbeds, and their surrounding ecologies as entities with rights. And he has 3 examples that many of you may be familiar with, but I'm not even that far into the book to know more than the first one. So just a suggestion. And I'm very curious. I'm gathering from this conversation that the rights of nature idea and concept, and clearly from Macfarlane's book, it's not brand new. So it's been implemented in some places. And I, for one, would welcome any resources on, and I think McFarlane's book is one, on where that has successfully been used as a tactic to protect and advocate for the natural resource.
Yeah, good point, Lucy. Thank you very much. I'm going to go back to Linda, wondering whether you've been able to fix your audio.
Yeah. I apologize. Can you hear me now?
Can do, yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, I don't know what's going on, but I MacGyvered it. So yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. I've been throwing a whole bunch of information in the chat, but I'm so pleased that you're having this talk about diplomacy and governance because it's so critical. And my background, I'm with a philanthropy here based in California, but I've been working in rights of nature for about 15 years. And I've been connected with Cormac Cullinan, who's based in Cape Town, and a number of other folks, Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, working with them to build up this movement, and got interested in rights of Antarctica, not only from sort of the general perspective of, advancing the next, opening the circle to the next round of rights, as we've done with human rights, but also from a diplomacy and governance perspective of shared commons, shared areas like the deep seabed space, the high seas, Antarctica, areas where, we can use these as models to create new models of diplomacy that we might be able to then extend to other areas. So I think all of I am not an expert on Antarctica personally. Jean, who is on this call, is much more of an expert than I, but from what I know, everything that's been said is absolutely true, that the area is threatened. The treaty based in 1959 didn't consider climate change. It wasn't something that was kind of on the radar so much back then. And so I love the concept of middle powers. The way this was created was more to exclude a lot of folks in the way of creating a treaty that only allowed several nations to be able to participate in governance per se. So I think that this does create a really wonderful opportunity. I put the Rights of Antarctica website in the chat. I'm actually flying in a couple hours to London for a series of meetings on this. So if anybody's in the London area in the next few days, would love to meet you, but would love to continue the conversation as well. There's been a lot of great scholarship and a lot of interest in this, and just so pleased that you're taking this up.
Yeah, great, Linda. Thank you for putting the resources into the chat. I mean, one of the things I think is really useful, and is if we could actually just raise the awareness of this issue, and if we can begin to share more information and get this into different spaces, because I think the big thing, and I'm guilty too, is ignorance about this issue, and how do we raise awareness? And it's good to see a philanthropy actually taking something like this so seriously, because philanthropies, as Andrew said, are not always kind of helpful in these kinds of issues that they regard as marginal, but are actually very central. That's really important. And Lucy, I think that put a useful piece in the chat too on that. I'm going to go back to Indy, and then I'm going to go to Louis. Indy first.
Yeah, no, appreciate this, and I perhaps just have more of a question for us to deliberate. That the rights of nature, do they work in a world driven by existential existence of powers? So you could make an argument that the Trump administration is moving on a basis of an existential idea of America being viable in terms of the world of a generative AI future. That is their existential worldview. They are operating on an idea of a 200-year hegemony or a loss of control of the future. And it's the existential idea. It's not wouldn't it be nice? It's not a diplomacy idea. It's saying we do not exist if we do not move forward. And my question, and I suppose this was the kind of question of what are the tools available to us when this turns into an existential framework of existence, and what is the diplomacy landscapes of negotiation in that reality versus the reality when I think the nature rights movement was born, and we've been part of many of those conversations, which have been about how does a river get its rights, or how does, we've been part of this. And I wonder, when the question become existential, all those positions become fragile, because actually they're rooted in the rule of law rather than the rule of survival. And I just wanted to open this conversation up, because one of the questions for me, and Apolline, maybe I was going to come to you around this, was that if we were to make the Antarctic self-sovereign, would it help, or would it be more powerful if somebody who is vulnerable to the effects of losing the Antarctic was able to sue on the basis of the damage being done to the Antarctic by third parties, so attribution through the intermediary? And is it possible to create these cascades of liability? And would those cascades of liability be more powerful than making a self-sovereign Antarctic, which would actually make those cascades of liabilities perhaps more difficult in terms of governance? And I don't know, legally, I'm just really interested. And it goes back a little bit to the point that was being made earlier by, I'm sorry, the gentleman's name. Oh, I'm sorry, about the relationship of krill to fishing demands further upstream and using that krill. So do we need to take an entangled view of resolving this problem and recognizing the entanglements of this issue? Or do we want to create a separationist sort of single point view? I don't know. And I'm just asking, in this moment in time, is the rights of nature, self-sovereignty, is it going to give us what we want, given the violence is coming from an idea of existentialism of existence, as opposed to an idea, and thereby do we have to construct a different theory of diplomacy rooted in a deeper existential idea of self-survival, rooted in mutually assured thriving versus mutually assured destruction? Do you have to create a different base to which, a different myth, to use Apolline, your words, in order to construct a different logical legal frame, in order to be able to build a different form of diplomacy, in order to be able to construct a pathway? So it was just a question for us to maybe hold together and probably reflect on, and maybe there's some wisdom in the room I hope there's wisdom in the room more advanced than my thinking on this.
Thank you, Indy. Apolline, if you could hold that, think about that, and when I get back to you towards the end of the session, it would be great if you could have a go at that one, because I think that's really critical. In the meantime, there are quite a few. There's a queue, and I'm going to take them in the sequence that they put their hands up, which is Louis, Alexis, and Jean. Louis first.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, and thank you so very much for yet another round of exciting topics and conversations. I'm sitting here. It's not the first of these kind of conversations this week. It's not the first in the month. It's not the first in the year. There's one issue coming after the other. And I very much sympathize with you, Barry. So I sort of haven't seeing this pile. I haven't thought of Antarctica. And now you're putting Antarctica on that pile. And what I'm sitting with is the question, what to do, not in terms of what to do first, but how can we do all in once, given, and I like the notion when it came up, the question of playing by the rules. So what can we do if we have to have that question, if we're still playing by the rules, if whatever kind of world governance in the different treaties is in place and gets violated, what do we do then? And is there one path, or is there another path? Is that a legal path? Is that diplomacy? Is that sort of rebellion? Is that sort of resistance? And I don't know. And probably it's a mix of all of it. But at the very heart of it, looking at us as we are sitting in this call now, which is a very, very good thing, is the question that turns into a quest for a resilient and regenerative civil society in itself and for itself. So moving out of the frames where we consume governments and legal frameworks and world governance and world order and all that, to look into, and that's just very much resonating with what Indy just brought up with the existential questions. How can we in civil society support each other on an existential level, but starting with what we're doing on the level of sense making? What is happening at the moment, and how can we be in this together? How can we be with each other in this to strengthen, to connect, co-reflect, grow resilience and regenerativity where we are with the peoples around us? And that comes back to, where we started with Lucy Bernhard's a while ago. What could be the role of philanthropy in it? And it's not to say, oh, there's a concept and then we deploy it, but how can philanthropy grow into a new role that is co-facilitating, co-creating structures for a resilient and regenerative civil society? And landing on a bit of a more positive or optimistic note, I think what we're doing here is the right step. We're doing it already. Can we keep it up, please, and reconvene again and again and invite more to the party or to the cause? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louis. I think the answer to that is yes, we can. I think what we need to do towards the end of this session is to begin to say, well, what can we do next? Because clearly this discussion is surfacing some really central issues. And Linda's put a really interesting quote in the chat from Milton Friedman, saying it's the only time she's ever going to quote him. But it is about the crisis we are in, which does give us the opportunity to behave differently. I mean, Friedman was talking about the 1970s and the consequences of the Arab-Israeli war and stagflation and all that. But I mean, we do need to behave differently in civil society and in philanthropy and in governments and in the private sector too. Alexis, you're next.
Yes, I am next, and I have zero expertise in any of this. My expertise is more in story and in narrative, and I'm sitting here listening to all of you through that lens a little bit. And I've heard Andrew present on Antarctica before, and I'm having some of the same thoughts that I had then, which is everybody is fascinated about Antarctica when we hear about it, but then it's part of our unconscious as a human species. We forget about it. We forget about its existence. We go about as if it doesn't matter. And yes, there's this great myth, and there's all this, wonderful stuff that we can wake up on people around it. And I keep thinking of the tourists that are going there as consumers of something they so badly understand, right? And all these pushes and pulls that we're facing in the world today, this short-term, fear-driven, existential, different worldviews about how do we exist in the future, it feels like a narrative loss of control. And I'm not saying that there's a story that we can tell that's going to fix that. Not at all. That's not where this is coming from. I'm just kind of in the space of listening to everybody here. I felt grief. I felt anger. I felt fear. I felt a bit of hope, not a lot, right? I felt like we have to do something. I felt that there's nothing we can do. And it's like all this soup that's churning in me. And there's something in, what is it here that we can tap into on an individual level? And if we want to talk about rebuilding a civil society, what about the individual citizens within that civil society? How can we awaken something in people in small ways while all the other work that you guys are spearheading is going on? But how can we get people a little bit on board with some of the things that we're talking about?
people of all walks of life, people who are not experts, but just how do we tap into how vital this is on a very day-to-day basis?
A great question, Alexis. Thank you. And I mean, some of us, including me, are ignorant about the topic of this call, but do have some of the right sensibilities, as you do. And, making use of your narrative skill might be one of those things that we could begin to draw on. And actually, how do we implement this? The only things that are really going to make change in our society is if people wake up. And I think the crisis does give a chance to people waking up. The data shows that. There is increasing protest across the world, much of it not being reported. For example, in Serbia, there's been almost no coverage of the fact that every night there have been demonstrations. There have been general strikes in Belgium that people are beginning to see. And how do we actually, through civil society and philanthropy, begin to get these messages out there? And in a way, Louis is right, these discussions are important, and we need to have greater confidence in our ability, our moral imaginations, to take these issues further. Thank you. Jean.
Thank you. Sorry. Hi, thank you for this forum. As Linda mentioned, I'm also on the working group of the Antarctic Rights Alliance. But in my professional life, I'm a researcher at the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, which is actually interesting in its combination of the physical sciences and the social sciences and the humanities. I would call myself a historian more than anything else. And as such, I just wanted to just raise one point, which is to do with the Antarctic Treaty and the fact that it has got quite a lot of slack recently for good reasons, especially where it comes to the blockages that we're seeing in terms of the conservation in the Southern Ocean and krill. But which so it's got a lot of sort of worrying. There's a lot of press about how it's falling apart or misrepresentations of how fragile it is, which it is fragile, and there are problems with it. But nevertheless, it remains the only vehicle through which the international community actually converses and tries to agree on Antarctica, even if it doesn't always or sufficiently. And indeed, it is the place where Western nations, European, North American nations, are able to speak about Antarctica to Russia, China, South Asian nations, etc. And as such, I think we have to be very mindful of that. And this is something that I share with other members of the Antarctica Rights Working Group as an opinion, which is that the rights of nature are perhaps should not be put in opposition to the Antarctic Treaty, but rather be thought of as something that one might one day find a way for it to survive, or actually that should inform the treaty, or that at this stage, with this treaty still alive, it should feed the treaty rather than be in opposition to it. Not everyone necessarily agrees with this. That's really my point of view, and one that I share with a number of people I know in our working group. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of intervene about this because it's kind of a warning shot, and in trying to reach something better, you might throw out the baby with the bathwater, to use the expression. And so let's perhaps find ways through the rights of nature and others possibly ways to sort of reinforce the treaty, or at least not to undermine the good work that it does do.
Thank you, Jean. That's really a salutary thing to say. I don't see anybody else wanting to speak, but I'd like to turn to Tom. Tom, you've been putting some really interesting comments in the chat. I just wondered whether you wanted to kind of give any overview of what you've written there, any kind of thoughts, and then after that I'm going to go back to Apolline and Indy and Andrew in that order, just to give some final kind of thoughts, and maybe in conditioning those final thoughts, perhaps you could say, what are the things that have come out of this discussion you think that we might take forward into another one? Because I think this has raised some really serious issues at all sorts of levels, and in a way, I think that if we follow what Louis said, keep the momentum going, and think about some of the things we might do before another discussion. One of the things which occurred to me, for example, would be to write this up and try to get some of this stuff into the philanthropy journals like Alliance. I can help with that because I've got a connection there. Just to begin to raise awareness to things that people can do. But could I turn to you, Tom, and just give us a sort of flavour of some of the things you've been studiously putting in the chat?
Thanks. I'd rather not, but I just find this to be more informational as well as inspirational, and kind of appreciate the different perspectives in the call. That where do we go from here? So rather than re-say what I've been trying to listen actively in this, I'd rather listen to how we go forward. So thanks for
I just thought that some of the things you were writing there were very perceptive. Anyway, people can read those for themselves. Let's go, Apolline. Indy asked you a question. If you want to answer that, that'd be great. And other things you might want to say as a result of this discussion, particularly how we might go forward. Any thoughts?
Thanks, Barry. No, I'm happy to answer the question because I think it weaves in a lot of the themes which were brought after, so that's great. On the first one, when Indy, you were mentioning, is it the most relevant to think about the right of natures, considering that we might be looking down at the dereliction of the rule of law? On that one, I think that fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not exactly sure, but when you look at litigation to create liability for whatever is done in Antarctica or which has an impact on it, cooperation between the states, even under that new theory of, mutual preservation or Antarctica rights, they are all based on the rule of law. They all require it one way or another. So I think if we are in a position where the rule of law is completely gone, then we're definitely in trouble on all parts. If it exists in some parts, which is probably what will happen, then, it becomes a question of strategy of what can we harness and what can we use. Then on the second one, so again on that, I guess, polarity between mitigation, which could create liability for the states or for companies, versus Antarctica rights. Again, I'm not sure there is such a polarity actually, because if you think about that litigation that you could do against states or against companies, having even one state who adopt an equivalent of the declaration for Antarctica rights, which mean that they would integrate that into their national law. It could help with standing. It could help with the establishment of a causal link between, an action and the problem. So that could actually, even for one state, help litigation and therefore open the doors for others. And it could also potentially help the perception of the judges in that state on what matters, what has to be prioritized, what needs to be protected. So it could create an environment which would help the litigation itself. And then on, where do we start? Because there is also a question on priorities. Again, I rarely think in that ecosystem that it's one versus another. I think we need both. But what is for sure is when you see direct pressure which are growing, such as krill fishing or like a mining license in Antarctica, I would definitely go for litigation in any way I can for that one, because you try to prevent further harm. And then when it comes to really which theory or which idea, which legitimacy grounding could bring states to cooperate peacefully to regenerate Antarctica, which is a very important question. Here again, I find it useful to look at the evolution of international law and policy. And on one hand, clearly self-preservation and self-interest has been driving a lot of what has been happening there. So here you could definitely say that that idea of mutual preservation could be a very strong driver to bring a renewed cooperation and hopefully an expanded cooperation. On the other hand, you also see that some of the greatest evolution in international law didn't come really from self-preservation, but also came from an idea which was so inspiring for such a big group of people that it kind of had an impulse which could be carried at that level. So there I also see how a new perception of Antarctica could help. So again, not mutually exclusive, but actually having both ideas living at the same time in the ecosystem, I think it could really help.
Thank you, Abalu. That's great.
Yeah. And on what's next, Barry, I will definitely bring a few ideas for litigation internally.
Thank you. Some interesting notes in the chat from Graham and a book recommendation from Linda that is worth checking out when you get when you review the recording after our session. Can I now turn to Indy? Thoughts as a result of this discussion, and where next, Indy?
Firstly, just a massive thank you to everyone for being here and being part of this conversation. I think reflections I'm walking away with are one, Apolline, how do we build a civic litigation fund for the Antarctic, a global planetary cooperative? It's an extension of what we were talking about for London, but why don't we do it for the Antarctic? What can we do in terms of everyday power and the construction of a viable fourth estate, which is not just rooted in information, but in actually a power of the force of law, which currently still exists for the short time. Second, I think one of the things I've been holding in this call is this question about a shift in our moral imperative, where the moral structure from which we are constructing the rule of law is shifting as countries operate on the idea of existential theories of survival. And what does that do in terms of the spaces of negotiation and what is perceived, what is the perceived acceptable space of operation? And I think that's a fundamental question that I think is very difficult for us to perceive collectively, because we've lived in the kind of safety of a post-World War II reality, which hasn't had to deal with this much more fundamental shift. And that's something that I'm if a nation state feels it's existential to its survival to doing something, does it thereby have the automatic legitimacy to do it? Because it's an existential thing, and sovereignty grants it. And what does that mean? That's a doubt that and what I'm appreciating is doubts rather than certainties here for a moment, because I think these are spaces of exploration. I think the other thing I'm really enjoying but appreciating is the spectrum of how we move from nature rights to entangled rights to treaties, and how are we going to live across the spectrum, and especially in the violence that we've seen, that I don't want to put it through that level, especially when we're seeing a world that is now able to move unilaterally. A single power can unilaterally make moves because it feels from an existential level it seeks to do that. And I'm really questioning whether we're holding onto a treaty because we see it as the only safe ground, or whether this requires bold action. And I don't know. This spectrum of how we hold this reality, I think is really interesting. On a potential level, I really appreciated Saudi Arabia point joining the treaty, because what that also makes me think is maybe the Antarctica is the location of the new planetary parliament, a landscape for planetary conversations that may be made possible because of its true nature. And that may be where the new UN will be born. It won't be born in New York or in London or in Saudi. They'll be born in somewhere there because it has a planetary scale inference and a planetary scale disaster scenario, risk scenario, which forces a new type of planetary governance to be born. So how do we allocate towards that? And I think, yeah, and the final thing was this sort of, Andrew mentioned this as well, is maybe planetary leadership will come from the middle powers. And how do we convert a politics of the middle powers? And middle powers are more powerful than they've ever been, by the way, in history. Their ability to do third-party interventions is greater than it's ever been. And how do we convene an alliance of middle powers which neither have the autocracy to rule the world, but they have the risks and liabilities of entanglements? So maybe the future planetary and safety is going to be constructed by the middle powers, not the superpowers. And I find that interesting and different from what I've heard, and it builds on actually Steve sorry, I can't remember. Tamsin, you could probably reference him. He talked about the role of the middle power, so I don't want to take anything away from a particular gentleman that's been looking at that, but I think there's something interesting and more interesting in that. So those are some just reflections. I appreciate this is not certainties, but I really like the fact that we're creating our own doubts, and maybe the doubts and breaking some of the world views that we've all lived in, and thereby opening up space for new forms of exploration in that pathway of the future. So just massive thanks. Thank you.
Sorry, Andrew. Thank you, Indy. That's terrific. And I mean, doubts actually are a precondition of creativity, because if you're not doubting anything, you're never going to be creative. So I think we don't worry about doubt. We see doubt as a decent part of the process. But I think one of the things, I think, on your point about the age of security to the age of smash and grab, really, it's here already. The volume of war, violent conflict, has increased by 65% since 2021. That's in 4 years. So we are on a trajectory which is very unhelpful, to say the least. Andrew, you started all this, so you're going to get the final word. But thank you, before you start, for stimulating such an amazing array of contributions. Thank you to everyone. It's just been terrific. But what do you make of this, and where should we go with this?
Thanks, Barry, and thank you all for a really stimulating session. I've really enjoyed hearing from all of you and reading the comments. A couple of things that come to mind during the discussion. I'd just like to share some of my interactions with politicians here in Australia. When I go to our nation's capital, Canberra, and explain the work that the Foundation was doing, and also the importance of Antarctica, I've sat with ministers and with their advisors, and they have portfolios. So the environment portfolio is like 30 big items. And you see them sit there and they say, oh, it's Antarctica, and they have it down at 23 on their priority list. And then I explain to them, this is what it is, this is why it's important, this is why we're there, this is how we've been there for so long. And you can see them doing the calculus. Wait on, this shouldn't be at 23. This should be like right up near the top. And then the political calculus comes in and it starts to fall away, because they go, well, there's no votes down in Antarctica. And so it falls from 3 down to 5 and 8 and back to 23. And so there's either no votes in Antarctica or there's 26 million Australian votes in Antarctica. And the reason being, I've tried to keep this global, but from a local standpoint, when it's hot in Antarctica, we get driving rains and floods. When it's cold in Antarctica, we get bushfires and droughts, because we live in a fulcrum with Antarctica, a symbiotic relationship here in Australia, where it affects our weather, our climate, as a one-to-one relationship. Now, Indy's point about Saudi Arabia, bringing these other powers in, helping them understand the importance of it. But as we've discovered tonight, there's a modal confusion, which this sounds really important, but why haven't I heard about this? And then what can I do? Seems like I need to do something, but what exactly can I do? And so it's really up to a group like us to move through that modal confusion and create a narrative around why we need to look after Antarctica. To set a global parliament in Antarctica, I think is a fantastic idea. And the last point that I'd make is that when one goes to Antarctica, one is left with a sense of a deep sense of deep time. Okay, the glaciers in Antarctica behind me in my background, they move at 200 meters per year. Everything moves slow, but it moves with intention. That deep time is not part of our model. It's not part of our current thinking. We live in an age now of consequences. This is the age of consequences. We live in a moment where our elites do understand, though they may not outwardly admit, that our economic model is at war with life on Earth. That's it. And so that narrative that we create must be necessarily framed in deep time. That's where we need to push our focus out. And if we can do that in a connected sense, the comments here in the chat around how do we connect Antarctica to our daily lives, Australians are starting to realise that our floods and fires and droughts and rains are all predicated on what happens in Antarctica. We need to do very similar for a global community, which is, yes, it's a big globe, but it's actually a very, very small world, as Walt Disney said. So thank you very much for tonight. I really appreciate the interaction. It's been fantastic.
Thank you, Andrew, and really great speech at the beginning. It was so clear, and thank you all for showing up. This is the Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. And we'll be back.
Back on the 10th of June, everyone. You'll get the summary of this and the recording and an invitation to the next conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you.
Bye.
Thanks, Indy. Thanks, Barry. Thanks, Tamsin. Thank you all.